Okay, good morning. So today we're looking at GMOs and transgenic organisms, okay? So a GMO stands for a genetically modified organism, and when we say modified, meaning its DNA sequence could have been changed in some way, so maybe adding in a few nucleotides into the sequence, or maybe a gene could have been removed, or maybe there could be a change to a regulatory gene. So something has been done to change the genetics in some way. That's what a genetically modified organism means. A transgenic organism is an organism that has had a gene inserted from a foreign source. So it's had DNA from another organism put into it, i.e. genes from another organism put into its DNA. Now obviously, when that happens, that is modifying the DNA in some way. So we can say that all transgenic organisms are genetically modified organisms. However, not all genetically modified organisms are transgenic organisms. To be transgenic, they must have DNA from an outside source inserted into them. Okay? So why do we do this? So why do we modify genetics? Why do we even sometimes insert DNA from foreign sources into them? Well, sometimes it's to aid the commercial properties of a crop. And a good example of that is the flavour saver tomato. So tomatoes over time will begin to ripen, and then they'll begin to essentially rot. And that's actually quite helpful for the tomato. It can make it easier for them to actually get the seeds out into the environment. So tomatoes want to eventually rot. However, that's not very good from a commercial property. Nobody wants to eat rotten tomatoes. So the flavour saver tomato has been modified to stop the gene that causes the ripening to develop into the rotting. It stops that gene functioning. So it's modified by preventing a gene functioning. And as a result, the tomatoes stay riper for far, far longer, which is obviously much better when you're transporting them all around the country or even all over the world to be sold in different places. Another good example as well is golden rice, which is a transgenic organism, which is rice that's had vitamin A from the gene for vitamin A from carrots inserted into it. Vitamin A is really important in developing eyesight. Loads and loads of people in some of the poorest parts of the world survive almost entirely on rice, and therefore they don't get vitamin A, which can result in vision difficulties and even blindness over time. So golden rice is a way of ensuring that people on this very meagre diet still get the vitamin A into their diet, which is something. It doesn't really solve the underlying issue, but at least prevents the difficulties arising from it, which is good. But also for the why we do this, sometimes just because it's cool. So there's something called the glowfish, which is a transgenic organism. And the glowfish has been modified by having a green fluorescent protein gene inserted into it from a jellyfish. So it's transgenic because the addition of a gene has come from a foreign source. It's not just changing a few bases or removing a gene. So that was just done to make a fish glow in the dark, and these glowfish that you can buy at pet stores in most places in the world, they'll glow in the dark, which is just interesting. So sometimes we genetically modify or make organisms transgenic just because we can. So talking about the ethics of GMOs, which is quite important, there are a few biological issues that they raise. So, for example, they reduce genetic variation. Obviously, a lot of the time when we're genetically modifying, we're removing genes, which is reducing variation. It could cause new mutations to happen. When we interfere with DNA, that can make new mutations more likely. And there's the risk of cross-pollination. Obviously, we grow these genetically modified crops in farmland fields for the most part. And there's nothing really stopping them being pollinated by bees or any other insects that then go into other fields, or just blowing into other fields. And when that happens, we could introduce the genetically modified strain into the natural environment. And that's probably wrong. That's interfering with nature a bit. You know, if we're doing it just for food, that's one thing. But if it begins to interfere with wild populations, it's a bit ethically tricky. There's a couple of social issues as well. First of all, there's the food safety issue. Are these genetically modified foods safe to eat? The answer to that, for the most part, is actually yes. There have been a few instances in the past of fear about them, but genetically modified organisms nearly always are safe to eat, because a lot of the time there's not any big changes to them. It's a thing that can get sort of blown up by the media a bit about them sounding really dangerous. People don't like the term genetically modified, but really, for the most part, yeah, it's overblown worry, but we still have to make sure they are safe before they go to public consumption. I remember seeing a poll a few years ago, like a survey a few years ago, where they asked a group of, I think it was in America, and they asked a group of the public, would you feel comfortable eating food that has genes in it? And like 50% said no. And obviously, all food has genes in it, because all food ultimately comes from a living thing. So, yeah, education can be an issue, and people can misinterpret what things mean, and they just think genetically modified sounds really scary when it maybe isn't. But anyway, other issues include, is it right to interfere with an organism's genome? Is it our place to do that? That's one to think about. There's issues to do with inequality in farmers. So obviously some farmers can afford to get access to these crops and others can't. Then there's the issue of labelling for consumers. So, even if genetically modified organisms, even if they are safe, they probably should still be labelled to make sure that everyone knows they're safe. And finally, there's the issue of Monsanto, which are a pretty significant genetically modified organism company, but there's been some quite worrying things that they've done ethically over time. You can research it yourself, but yeah, they can be a bit of a concern. So Monsanto are an issue with GMOs as well. Anyway, that is everything from me today. Obviously, check the work you need to do on Google Classroom and check into Zoom if you need any help with anything. Thank you.